The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astoria Ballroom dripped light onto a sea of silk and diamonds, but for Clara, the glare felt like an interrogation. She stood frozen, the epicenter of a sudden, cruel silence. The man before her, a tech mogul whose name was plastered on half the city's new buildings, sneered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You're little more than the help who's forgotten her place." His words, sharp and deliberate, were a public execution of her dignity. Every eye in the room was on her, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Her borrowed dress felt like a costume, her presence a mistake. She held his gaze, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, her silence her only shield against the crushing weight of his contempt. But what happened in the wake of that silence would change everything, and if you watch until the end, you will understand the impossible connection born in that moment. Subscribe to our channel now and tell us in the comments where you are watching this story unfold. Clara Hayes, 28 years old, was a nurse. Her world was one of sterile corridors, the quiet beep of heart monitors, and the hushed, desperate conversations of families in waiting rooms. This gala, an event to honor her hospital's community service, felt like a foreign planet. She was a guest of honor in name only, an exhibit to make the wealthy feel benevolent. Her simple navy dress, the most expensive thing she owned, felt plain and inadequate amidst the couture gowns. Her hands, accustomed to the practical work of saving lives, felt clumsy holding a champagne flute. She was an observer by nature, more comfortable in the background, and being thrust into the spotlight this way felt like a violation. The pressure on her was more than just the weight of 100 judgmental stares. It was the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones after a week of double shifts. It was the mounting stack of her mother's medical bills on her small kitchen table, a constant, silent reminder of her obligations. It was the condescending tone of the hospital administrators who saw nurses as replaceable cogs in a machine. This ballroom, with its casual opulence, was a stark, painful illustration of the chasm between her world of quiet, desperate necessity and their world of effortless power. She was trapped, not by walls, but by a sense of duty that felt both like her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. Her sense of justice, forged in the face of so much systemic indifference, burned quietly within her. She had seen life and death decided by the cold arithmetic of insurance policies and had fought for patients who had no one else. The mogul's casual cruelty wasn't just a personal insult. It was an offense against every person who worked tirelessly without recognition, every person deemed insignificant by the powerful. She thought of the young boy she had comforted in the ER just last night, his fear more real than any stock market fluctuation. That was the world that mattered. This glittery, hollow spectacle felt profane in comparison, and her spirit recoiled from its inherent unfairness. The air, thick with expensive perfume and the low murmur of gossip, suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. The sound of the string quartet playing softly in the corner seemed to mock the tension coiled in the center of the room. Light from the chandeliers fractured through half-empty glasses on abandoned tables, casting distorted patterns on the polished marble floor. Clara focused on a single point of light reflecting in a puddle of spilled wine, a tiny, crimson star on the vast, dark floor. It was a small detail in a sea of overwhelming sensations, a focal point to anchor her against the rising tide of humiliation and a strange, unidentifiable sense of dread. She was a creature of a different ecosystem, one where value was measured in compassion and resilience, not net worth. Her quiet dignity was her armor, meticulously maintained through years of tending to the broken and the forgotten. She had learned to absorb pain, to witness suffering without shattering, and to offer comfort with hands that asked for nothing in return. Here, that same strength was perceived as weakness, her silence as submission. The stark contrast between her internal fortitude and her external vulnerability was a chasm no one in this room could ever hope to understand. They saw a humbled nurse. They couldn't see the warrior within. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a sudden drop in the room's temperature, a subtle change in the pressure of the air. The ambient chatter, which had begun to tentatively resume, faltered and died once more. The collective gaze of the crowd seemed to drift from her, pulled toward the deep shadows near the ballroom's grand entrance. A palpable stillness descended, but this time it was not one of spectacle. It was a silence of deference, of caution. It was a silence of fear. From the corner of her eye, Clara saw a figure detach itself from the darkness, a silhouette of tailored darkness moving with an unnerving, predatory grace. The city lights smeared against the bus window, melting into long, wet streaks of neon and gold as it rumbled away from the heart of downtown. For Clara, the journey home was always a descent, a slow peel back of worlds. She had just left the crystalline heights of the Grand Astoria, a place of impossible architecture and casual cruelty, and was now plunging back into the grit and honesty of her own neighborhood. The polished marble of the ballroom gave way to cracked pavement glistening under the sulphurous glow of street lamps. The air inside the bus was thick with the scent of damp wool and the collective exhaustion of late-night workers. She was a ghost between two realities, belonging to neither, her borrowed elegance dissolving with every mile that separated her from that cold, glittering room. Her apartment was a small, quiet space on the fourth floor of a pre-war walk-up, a sanctuary held together by sheer will. Everything had its place. The worn but comfortable armchair, the single thriving orchid on the windowsill, the neat stack of medical journals on her coffee table. But atop the small kitchen counter sat another stack of papers, these far less orderly. Envelopes with angry red lettering, complex insurance statements, and letters from collections agencies formed a precarious tower of anxiety. This was the silent, crushing weight that defined her existence. The silence in her apartment wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken numbers of her mother's illness and the constant, nagging fear of not being enough to hold it all at bay. The next morning, the ritual began. Her nurse's uniform, crisp and white, was her armor. Pulling it on was a transformation, a shedding of the vulnerable Clara for the competent, unflappable Nurse Hayes. The fabric was stiff, impersonal, designed to be sterile and efficient, a stark contrast to the deep well of empathy she drew from each day. It was a symbol of her purpose, but also a mark of her station, the very thing the mogul had used to diminish her. As she pinned her name badge over her heart, she felt the familiar dichotomy of her life, the immense power to heal and comfort held within a role the world so often rendered invisible, treating her and her colleagues as little more than functional, replaceable parts in a vast, uncaring machine. The public hospital was a symphony of controlled chaos. The air hummed with the beep of monitors, the squeak of gurney wheels, and the low, constant murmur of pain and worry. Clara moved through it with a practiced grace, a calm center in a relentless storm. Her supervisor, Miss Albright, a woman whose exhaustion had long ago curdled into a permanent, sharp-edged impatience, ruled the floor with an iron clipboard. Hayes, bed 4 needs a new IV, bed 7 is complaining again, and try to look a little more cheerful, you're scaring the patients. The words were clipped, devoid of warmth, another small, daily erosion of her spirit. It was an environment where burnout was not a risk, but an expectation, and kindness was a currency in desperately short supply. Yet it was here, in the trenches of human suffering, that Clara found her meaning. She bypassed the sterile commands to connect with the person lost in the hospital gown. She spent a few extra moments with an elderly man terrified of the coming night, his hand, frail and paper-thin, gripping hers as if it were a lifeline. She listened, not just to his symptoms, but to the story of his late wife, his voice cracking with a grief that no medicine could touch. In these quiet, stolen moments, she waged her own private war against the indifference of the system. This was her silent rebellion, to treat the soul as well as the body, to offer a sliver of dignity in a place that so often stripped it away. Later that evening, after a grueling 12-hour shift, the phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but knew by heart. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of compassion. It spoke of outstanding balances, payment plans, and the consequences of inaction. Clara stood in her small kitchen, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, her body aching with fatigue, and listened. She gave the same answer she always did, promising a payment she wasn't sure she could make, her voice steady while her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. The call ended, and the silence that rushed back in was even heavier than before. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of time and money she did not have. Her mother's call came an hour later. Her voice was thin, fragile, but laced with a determined cheerfulness that broke Clara's heart. "Are you eating properly, dear? You sound tired." Clara leaned against the cool glass of her window, watching the distant, indifferent lights of the city. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a long day. Everything's fine." The lie was automatic, a reflex honed by years of shielding her mother from the harsh realities. She was the protector, the strong one, the one who absorbed all the fear so her mother wouldn't have to. This emotional solitude was the heaviest burden of all, a profound isolation forged from love and a desperate sense of duty. Before sleep claimed her, she pulled a worn book from her shelf. It wasn't a medical text, but a collection of architectural designs, soaring glass structures and homes that blended seamlessly with nature. Tucked inside was a faded sketch she had drawn in college, a blueprint for a life she had once imagined, one filled with light, space, and creation. It was a ghost of a dream, a painful reminder of the woman she might have been if life hadn't demanded she become a warrior instead. She traced the lines with her finger, a quiet moment of mourning for a path not taken, before closing the book and surrendering to a fitful, dreamless sleep, knowing the morning would demand the same fight all over again. The memory of the gala ambushed her during a rare moment of quiet on the ward. The mogul's sneering face, the collective stare of the crowd, his words echoing in the vast, opulent space, little more than the help. The public humiliation had left a deeper wound than she'd realized. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict delivered by the world she saved every day. It confirmed her deepest fear, that her sacrifice, her compassion, her very essence was worthless in the eyes of those who held all the power. The shame was a physical presence, a cold weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe, a fresh layer of armor she now had to build around her already guarded heart. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. 2 days later, a commotion erupted near the nurses' station. A small entourage of men in expensive suits swept through the ER, clearing a path. At their center was the tech mogul from the gala, a pristine white bandage wrapped around his hand from a minor, self-inflicted cut. He spotted her, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He walked directly to her, his voice low enough for only her and her supervisor to hear. "I trust the hospital's board knows how to handle employees who can't remember their place." Ms. Albright's face went pale. The threat was unmistakable, a cold, calculated strike against her livelihood. In that moment, Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her, leaving her utterly exposed and terrifyingly alone. Just as the mogul's final venomous word hung in the sterile air, a profound stillness fell over the emergency room. It was different from the shocked silence that had followed his outburst at the gala. This was a heavy, deferential quiet, as if the very atoms in the air had been commanded to halt. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim, and the rhythmic beeping of the machines faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. Ms. Albright's face, moments ago flushed with panic, was now ashen with a deeper, more primal fear. She, like everyone else, felt the shift, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, the unmistakable arrival of a predator in their midst. A presence had entered their world, one that did not belong among the sick and the dying, but commanded both with an effortless authority. From the shadows of the main entrance, a figure emerged. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his imposing frame, his steps making no sound on the linoleum floor. He was dressed in a suit of such a dark charcoal gray, it seemed to absorb the light around it, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and discipline. His face was a study in controlled severity, with sharp, intelligent features that gave nothing away. But it was his eyes that held the room captive, dark, unnervingly still, and possessing a chilling depth of knowledge. He was Julian Thorne, a man whose power was not announced but felt, a ghost in the city's machine whose influence was absolute and whose name was a prayer on some lips and a curse on others. He did not look at Clara. His entire focus, a force as tangible as a physical blow, was fixed on the tech mogul. The mogul, who had commanded the room with his blustering rage just moments before, now seemed to shrink, his arrogance deflating like a punctured lung. Julian stopped a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He radiated a dangerous calm, the kind that precedes a storm of unimaginable violence. His stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. He was the center of a new gravity, pulling all attention, all fear, all power toward himself. And in his silent appraisal, he passed a judgment more final than any court of law could ever render. The air grew thin, charged with the unspoken history of a man who dealt in consequences. "You have a problem with the staff here?" Julian's voice was low, a resonant baritone that carried no hint of anger, yet it sliced through the silence with the clean, cold edge of a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience, a weapon in its own right. The mogul stammered, his bravado utterly stripped away, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Mr. Thorne, this is a private matter." Julian took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "This hospital is under my protection, which means its people are under my protection. Apologize to the nurse." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an alteration of reality that the mogul had no choice but to accept. The command was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or pride. As the humiliated mogul mungled a hasty, insincere apology, a man in a similarly sharp suit stepped to Julian's side, murmuring something too low for Clara to hear. The words, however, caused a visible change in Julian. His focus, which had been locked on his target with predatory intensity, suddenly broke. The iron control in his expression faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by something unreadable, something that looked almost like shock. His gaze lifted from the now irrelevant mogul and, for the first time, moved to Clara. It was as if the world around them had dissolved, leaving only the two of them suspended in that singular, charged moment. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, one that was far more personal and infinitely more complex. He truly saw her. The gaze that settled on her was no longer that of a powerful man defending his territory. It was something else entirely. It was searching, intense, and shockingly vulnerable. In her tired, defiant eyes, he saw not the face of a stranger, but an echo of a debt he never knew he owed. He saw the quiet strength that had held him to life on a sterile operating table months ago, the anonymous gift of life that had flowed from her veins into his. He saw the source of the blood that now beat in his own heart, a purity, a selflessness he believed had been extinguished from the world, and most certainly from himself. The discovery destabilized him, cracking the cold facade he had so carefully constructed over a lifetime of violence and loss. Clara felt the weight of his stare like a physical touch. It was nothing like the mogul's leering contempt. This was deeper, a gaze that seemed to bypass her uniform, her exhaustion, her fear, and see directly into the carefully guarded core of her being. She felt an involuntary shiver trace its way down her spine. It was not entirely fear, though that was certainly part of it. It was a terrifying, magnetic pull, a sense of being recognized by a force of nature she could not possibly comprehend. For a dizzying second, she felt as if this man, this stranger cloaked in power and shadow, knew her most secret pains and her most resilient hopes. It was an intimacy so sudden and profound that it left her breathless and exposed. The mogul and his entourage had vanished, retreating as if they were never there. Julian stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. He stopped just short of invading her personal space, a gesture of respect that seemed entirely at odds with the danger he embodied. "You gave me back my life," he said, his voice now stripped of its commanding edge, leaving only a quiet, raw sincerity. "You did so without knowing whose it was. Now, allow me to ensure no one ever dares to threaten yours again." The words were a vow, a shield forged in the fires of his dark world and placed squarely in front of her. He held her gaze for one moment longer, a silent transaction passing between them that neither could articulate. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of a deep, ancient sorrow, a wound that no amount of power or money could ever heal. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and was gone. He and his men moved like shadows, dissolving back into the city from which they came, leaving behind a silence that was even more profound than the one that had announced their arrival. The emergency room slowly came back to life, the beeping of machines returning to their normal rhythm, but the energy in the space was irrevocably altered. A line had been drawn, a bargain struck, and the world was no longer the same. Clara stood frozen, her hand instinctively rising to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The clinical, antiseptic smell of the hospital was gone, temporarily replaced by the faint, lingering sense of expensive wool, sandalwood, and something cold and clean, like the night air. His words echoed in her mind, not as a threat, but as a profound, terrifying, and undeniable truth. Something had shifted deep within her. The quiet, orderly world she had built to protect herself had been breached by a force she could neither fight nor understand. She was no longer just a nurse fighting a quiet battle for dignity. She was now under the protection of a king from a dark and violent kingdom, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that such protection would come at a price. He held her gaze for one moment longer, a silent transaction passing between them that neither could articulate. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of a deep, ancient sorrow, a wound that no amount of power or money could ever heal. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and was gone. He and his men moved like shadows, dissolving back into the city from which they came, leaving behind a silence that was even more profound than the one that had announced their arrival. The emergency room slowly came back to life, the beeping of machines returning to their normal rhythm, but the energy in the space was irrevocably altered. A line had been drawn, a bargain struck, and the world was no longer the same. Clara stood frozen, her hand instinctively rising to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The clinical, antiseptic smell of the hospital was gone, temporarily replaced by the faint, lingering sense of expensive wool, sandalwood, and something cold and clean, like the night air. His words echoed in her mind, not as a threat, but as a profound, terrifying, and undeniable truth. Something had shifted deep within her. The quiet, orderly world she had built to protect herself had been breached by a force she could neither fight nor understand. She was no longer just a nurse fighting a quiet battle for dignity. She was now under the protection of a king from a dark and violent kingdom, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that such protection would come at a price. He was a specter in her life, a silent observer whose intentions remained shrouded in a dangerous and alluring mystery. The intrusions became more direct. An envelope arrived, not with a bill, but with a statement from the hospital's financial office. Her mother's entire medical debt, a sum so astronomical it had felt like a life sentence, was marked "Paid in full, anonymous benefactor." The relief was a physical blow, a sudden lightness that made her dizzy, but it was immediately followed by a wave of cold fury. This was not a gift, it was a transaction. He was buying her, piece by piece, asserting ownership over her struggles and her obligations. The act stripped her of her agency, turning her most private battle into a demonstration of his power. It was a golden chain, and she could feel its weight settling around her neck, beautiful, generous, and utterly suffocating. She found him. It took 2 days of calling contacts she barely had, of piecing together whispers and rumors until she had a location. A sleek, minimalist restaurant downtown that served as his unofficial office. She walked in, her nurse's scrubs a stark white flag of defiance in a sea of dark suits. He was in a secluded booth, the city lights glittering behind him like a captured constellation. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply watched her approach, his expression unreadable, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the table before him. The air crackled with her righteous anger and his unnerving calm. She was a storm about to break against a mountain, and she knew, even as she prepared to speak, that the mountain would not move. "I cannot accept it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She placed a single envelope on the polished wood of the table. Inside was a check for her first ridiculously small repayment installment. "This is my debt, my responsibility." Julian looked from the envelope to her face, his gaze lingering on the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. He saw not ingratitude, but an integrity so profound it bordered on self-destruction. It was the same quality that had compelled her to donate her blood to a stranger, the same force that made her work herself to the bone for others. It was the very thing that drew him to her, and the very thing his world was designed to crush. He was fascinated, and for the first time in a long time, deeply unsettled. He didn't take the envelope. "Your responsibility," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is to heal people. Your strength should not be wasted fighting battles that men like me can end with a single phone call." The statement was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of arrogance, that it was more disarming than any argument. He saw the world in terms of problems and solutions, power and its application. Her world was built on effort, on struggle, on the moral value of the fight itself. They were speaking different languages, their moral compasses oriented to entirely different poles. In his quiet, logical dismissal of her principles, she felt the terrifying vastness of the chasm between their realities, and a flicker of fear replaced her anger. As she left the restaurant, a cold rain began to fall, turning the city streets into a slick, reflective black mirror. Her bus was late, and she stood huddled under a failing awning, the chill seeping into her bones. A black car, silent as a shark, pulled up to the curb beside her. The back window glided down, revealing Julian in the dimly lit interior. "You will catch a chill," he stated, not as an invitation, but as an observation. "Get in, I will take you home." It was another command disguised as a curtsy. The thought of being enclosed with him in that small, luxurious space was terrifying, but the biting wind and the prospect of a long, cold wait were a more immediate misery. Reluctantly, she complied, slipping into the silent, leather-scented darkness. The ride was silent, but the quiet was heavy, charged with unspoken thoughts. The car moved through the rain-swept city, a hermetically sealed world of warmth and safety. Clara stared out the window, watching her own neighborhood with its familiar grit and wariness slide by through the tinted glass. It looked like a foreign country from inside this vehicle. She was acutely aware of him beside her, of the sheer physical space he occupied. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his attention, a palpable weight in the air. The proximity was unnerving, an intimacy that felt both dangerous and strangely protective. For a few brief minutes, the crushing weight of her world was held at bay by the man who was its very antithesis. "Why?" she finally whispered, the question resuscitating silence. He turned his head slowly, and in the fleeting glow of a passing streetlight, she saw the profound weariness in his eyes. It was a look that spoke of a lifetime of violence, of choices made in darkness that could never be undone. He began, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of the engine. "Because you," he began, "remind me that there was a world before this one. A world where things like goodness were simple, unconditional." It was the closest he had ever come to a confession, a glimpse into the barren landscape of his own soul. And in that moment, she saw not a monster, but a man trapped in a prison of his own making, reaching for a light he believed he could never touch. He began to appear in the periphery of her life with a quiet, deliberate frequency. She would see him across the street from the hospital, standing in the shadows of a doorway, simply watching. He never approached, never made a sound. He was just there, a silent guardian, a dark angel on the edge of her vision. His presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the invisible threads that now connected them. She felt his influence in the sudden, inexplicable deference of her supervisors, in the way minor bureaucratic problems that had plagued her for months simply vanished. He was tidying the edges of her life, smoothing her path with an invisible, powerful hand, and every act of kindness felt like another link in the chain binding her to him. For Julian, this obsession was a form of penance. Watching her move through her world with such quiet grace and unyielding empathy was a kind of self-flagellation. She was a living embodiment of every moral code he had broken, every innocent life his empire had indirectly damaged. Her compassion was a mirror reflecting his own monstrousness, and yet he could not look away. He was drawn to her light, not with the hope of sharing it, but with the desperate, self-destructive need to be near something pure before his own darkness consumed him completely. Protecting her became his new secret mission, a silent, solitary war waged against the chaos of his own making, a desperate attempt to preserve one good thing in a world he had filled with so much bad. He knew he was a danger to her. Every moment he spent in her orbit, every action he took on her behalf, pulled her deeper into his world. His enemies were legion, and his protection painted a target on her back. This knowledge was a constant, grinding torment. To truly protect her, he would have to leave her alone, to disappear from her life as suddenly as he had appeared. But the thought of severing that connection, of returning to the cold, empty silence of his existence before her, was unbearable. It was a selfish, dangerous desire, and he knew it. He was a drowning man clinging to a lifeboat, knowing full well he might pull it under with him. His control, the bedrock of his power, was fracturing. The tension between them was a taut wire, vibrating with fear and a strange, nascent longing. When he brought his most trusted man, Leo, to the hospital for a minor injury, he insisted Clara be the one to treat him. The examination room felt impossibly small. As she worked, her fingers brushing against his hand to check his pulse, a jolt of electricity passed between them. It was an accident, a clinical necessity, but it felt like a profound transgression. They both froze for a fraction of a second, their eyes meeting over his clasped hands. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, intense awareness of their physical proximity. It was a touch that carried the weight of everything unsaid, of the danger, the debt, and the impossible magnetic pull between their two worlds. She began to see the cracks in his armor. She noticed the way he held his left shoulder, a subtle stiffness that spoke of an old, poorly healed wound. She saw the network of fine, silvery scars on his knuckles, a testament to a violence his tailored suits could not completely conceal. These were not the marks of a king on a throne, but of a soldier who had fought his way out of the trenches. These small, human imperfections made him more real and, paradoxically, more dangerous. They were physical proof of a life he had lived, a life that was now inextricably tangled with hers. The myth of Julian Thorne was slowly being replaced by the reality of the man, and she found that the man was far more terrifying and far more compelling. The fear and fascination waged a constant war within her. She would lie awake at night, her mind replaying their brief, charged encounters. She feared the darkness that clung to him like a second skin, the casual way he wielded power that could shatter lives. But she was also drawn to the flicker of redemption she saw in his eyes, the deep, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. She was a healer, and she recognized a wound in him so profound it seemed incurable. A dangerous, foolish part of her wanted to try, to see if her light could reach the darkest corners of his soul. It was a temptation she knew could destroy her, a siren song pulling her toward a beautiful, deadly shipwreck. The truce with her supervisor, Miss Elbright, was short-lived. The woman's resentment simmered just beneath the surface, and one afternoon she found her chance. She cornered Clara in the medication room, a file in her hand. "I know what you are," Albright hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't know who he is, but I know you're using him. A nurse playing the whore for a powerful man. I filed a formal complaint with the ethics board. They'll be investigating you. Let's see if your protector can get you out of this." The accusation, so vile and so public, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and exposed in the cold, sterile room. That evening, as Clara walked home, her mind reeling from the day's events, a car screeched to a halt beside her. It wasn't Julian's. Two rough-looking men got out, their faces grim. "Miss Elbright sent a message," one of them growled, stepping into her path. "She wants you to know some problems don't just disappear." But before she could even scream, Julian's car materialized out of the darkness at the end of the street, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. It didn't speed. It glided toward them with a slow, menacing purpose. The two men froze, their bravado evaporating into pure terror. Julian stepped out, not looking at them, but at her. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. And in that moment, she knew that a line had been crossed and that his protection was about to become something terrifyingly real. He did not move toward the two men. His entire being, a universe of controlled violence, was oriented toward her. The headlights of his car carved him from the night, a figure of impossible stillness in the swirling rain. The thugs, caught between their intended victim and the apex predator who had just claimed her, were paralyzed by a fear so pure it was almost reverent. Julian's gaze swept over Clara, a clinical, intense assessment that missed nothing. The slight tremor in her hands, the defiant terror in her eyes, the rain plastering a strand of hair to her cheek. He was not looking at the threat. He was cataloging the damage done to the one thing he had decided to keep safe from his world. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, promising to shatter into 1,000 sharp pieces. "Are you hurt?" His voice was impossibly quiet, yet it cut through the sound of the rain and the city's low hum. It was a question directed only to her, a private inquiry in a brutally public space. In that moment, the two thugs ceased to exist as people. They were merely an environmental hazard, an obstacle to be removed. By speaking to her first, by making her well-being the singular focus of his attention, he broke the first rule of his own cold calculus. He was showing his hand, revealing a vulnerability that any of his true enemies would have killed to witness. He was no longer a king surveying his territory, but a man protecting something he valued more than strategy, more than power, more than the secrecy that had kept him alive for so long. Clara found her voice, a fragile thing against the storm of his fury. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Don't, please, don't do this." The plea was not for herself, and it was not for the two pathetic men who had threatened her. It was for him. She was seeing the monster she had only sensed, and in a desperate, foolish, and profoundly human act of empathy, she tried to pull him back from the edge. It was her own transgression, a violation of the victim's role. She was not asking for rescue, she was intervening, attempting to shield him from the consequences of his own nature. She was trying to save the man from the darkness he so effortlessly commanded, a healer trying to treat a wound that was, in fact, the source of his strength. Her words did not stop him. They sealed the men's fate. Her plea, so pure and so misplaced, was a confirmation of everything he was fighting to protect and everything he was destined to corrupt. He saw in her defiance a goodness he could never possess, and the sight of it ignited a cold, clean rage within him. He gave her a final, unreadable look, a look that was both an apology and a promise, before he turned his attention to the men. He moved then, not with the explosive speed of a brawler, but with the deliberate, fluid grace of a surgeon. There was no wasted motion, no theatricality. It was the pure, terrifying economy of a man for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a language he spoke with absolute fluency. The confrontation was over before it could be called a fight. It was a brutal, silent ballet of cause and effect. There was the soft whisper of his tailored coat cutting through the damp air, a sharp, sickening crack of bone, and then a second, identical sound. He dismantled them with a chilling precision, using just enough force to neutralize the threat and deliver a message that would travel through the city's underworld before the night was over. He left them broken on the wet pavement, groaning messes of ruined ambition, and turned away without a backward glance. He had not simply defeated them, he had erased them, rendering them utterly insignificant. The display was not for them. It was for her. It was a demonstration of what his protection truly meant. He stood before her again, the rain slicking his dark hair and running in rivulets down the shoulders of his perfect suit. He was untouched, immaculate, a stark contrast to the human wreckage he had left in his wake. The street was silent now, save for the soft hiss of the rain on the asphalt and the low, throbbing idle of his car's engine. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic and primal. She stared at him, unable to move, unable to breathe. She was seeing him for the first time, not as a powerful benefactor or a mysterious guardian, but as he truly was, a creature of profound and terrible darkness, a force of nature that could create safety only through absolute destruction. The myth was gone, and the reality was terrifying. He closed the remaining distance between them, his shoes making no sound on the drenched sidewalk. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold night air. She expected to see satisfaction in his eyes, or anger, or nothing at all. Instead, she saw a deep, aching sorrow. He was looking at her as if she were a ghost, a memory of a world he could see but never again touch. In her horrified gaze, he saw the reflection of his own actions. He had brought the violence he so desperately wanted to shield her from directly to her feet. He had proven her supervisor right. He had tainted her with his darkness, and he knew, with a certainty that hollowed him out, that he had just destroyed the very thing he sought to preserve. His hand came up, slow and deliberate, and he gently, almost reverently, brushed the rain-soaked strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was an earthquake. It was not a gesture of intimacy or desire, but of a profound, desperate, and sacred connection. It was the contact point between two colliding worlds, a moment of impossible tenderness in the heart of brutality. For Clara, the warmth of his fingers against her cold skin was a brand, a mark of ownership that seared through her fear. For Julian, it was an act of sacrilege. He was touching something pure with hands that had only ever broken things. It was a confession, a surrender, a final, damning admission of the feelings he could no longer control. In that single, fleeting touch, everything changed. She did not pull away. She simply watched him, her eyes wide, with a terrifying, dawning understanding. She saw the man beneath the monster, a soul so deeply wounded that violence was its only expression. He saw the unwavering strength in her, a light that did not flinch or fade even in the face of his darkness. He saw that his protection was a poison, and that he was the greatest danger she would ever face. He had broken his most sacred rule, never get close, never make it personal, and in doing so, had exposed them both to a truth that was as undeniable as it was destructive. He was a fallen king, and she was the one pure thing in his kingdom of shadows. He let his hand fall away, and the space between them instantly grew cold again, a chasm of unspoken consequences. The rain continued to fall, washing the street clean but leaving them both irrevocably stained. They stood in the aftermath, two statues in a silent tableau of transgression and revelation. There were no words left to say. He had crossed a line to protect her, and in doing so, had shown her exactly what she needed to be protected from. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a living thing, heavy with the weight of a world she had just seen born from violence, and the impossible truth of the man who ruled it. He turned without a word, the space where his hand had been on her cheek now feeling impossibly cold. He did not look back. He simply folded himself back into the silent, waiting car, a ghost retreating into its machine. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, its red taillights bleeding into the rain-slicked street before disappearing around a corner. Clara was left alone in the sudden, profound silence. The only sounds, the hiss of the rain on the asphalt, and the ragged, unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. The two men he had broken were a dark, groaning heap a few yards away, a brutal testament to the chasm that had just opened at her feet. She stood there for a long time, drenched and trembling, not from the cold, but from the terrifying, absolute finality of his departure. Back in the sterile safety of her apartment, the world felt tilted on its axis. The quiet space that had always been her sanctuary now seemed fragile, its walls too thin to keep out the memory of what she had witnessed. She looked at her small, thriving orchid on the windowsill, a symbol of her patient, nurturing nature, and it seemed like a relic from another life, a life before she understood the true meaning of violence. Every familiar object, the worn armchair, the neat stack of medical journals, the ticking clock on the wall, seemed to mock her with its innocence. She had seen the darkness that underpinned the city's glittering facade, and now that darkness had a name, a face, and the ghost of his touch was a brand she could feel on her skin long after she had scrubbed it raw. The consequences at the hospital were swift and silent. Miss Albright was simply gone. One day she was there, a fixture of sharp-edged impatience, and the next, her office was empty. No one spoke of it. There was no memo, no official announcement, just a gaping void filled with unspoken fear and cautious sideways glances in Clara's direction. Her colleagues treated her with a new, fearful deference, as if she were a fragile, unpredictable explosive. She was no longer just Nurse Hayes. She was a woman with an invisible, terrifying benefactor. The professional complaint against her vanished from the records as if it had never existed. This silent, bloodless efficiency was more chilling than any open threat. She was safe, but she was also utterly alone, isolated by the very power that was meant to protect her. Miles away, in a penthouse that pierced the clouds, Julian stood before a wall of glass, the rain-streaked city sprawling beneath him like a dark, glittering jewel. He had not slept. He saw her face in the reflection staring back at him. The shock, the fear, and the heartbreaking flicker of empathy she had shown for him, even as he embraced his own monstrosity. He had crossed a line, not by using violence, which was as natural to him as breathing, but by letting her see it. He had shattered her world to keep his own demons at bay. The act of protecting her had been the ultimate act of possession, and in doing so, he had tainted the one pure thing he had ever allowed himself to get close to. He retreated into the cold, familiar embrace of his solitude, the silence of his glass kingdom, a fitting penance for his transgression. For Clara, the days that followed were defined by a hollow, aching emptiness. The constant, low-grade anxiety about money had been replaced by a sharper, more profound sense of loss. The city felt quieter, the nights longer. She found herself watching the street from her window, half expecting his dark car to materialize from the shadows, a part of her dreading it and a part of her desperately hoping for it. The fear he inspired was a tangible thing, but the void he left behind was a far greater torment. It was the silence of a conversation that had barely begun, the absence of a presence that had, in a terrifyingly short amount of time, become a new center of gravity in her life. She was safe from the world, but she was not safe from the memory of him. His influence did not vanish entirely, it simply changed form, becoming more distant, more impersonal. An anonymous foundation, its origins untraceable, made a massive donation to the underfunded community health clinic where she volunteered on her days off, securing its future for the next decade. A new security system was installed in her apartment building overnight, paid for by an anonymous tenants association that didn't exist. These were his ghosts, his acts of contrition performed from a distance. They were gestures of a king protecting his realm from afar, but they offered no warmth. Each act of disembodied kindness was a fresh reminder of the chasm between them, a golden chain whose links were being forged in a darkness she could no longer pretend did not exist. The pain began to slowly, painstakingly transform into a hard-won clarity. The world no longer seemed black and white to her. She looked at the desperate, often violent patients in the ER with a new, unsettling understanding. She saw the fear behind their aggression, the desperation that drove them to actions they could not control. Her moral compass, once so fixed and certain, now spun in the face of a more complex, brutal reality. Julian had not broken her, he had broken her innocence. She was stronger now, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she had looked into the abyss and had not fallen. She was learning to navigate a world of shadows, her own small light burning with a fiercer, more resilient flame. Julian, meanwhile, fought a war of attrition against himself. His men brought him daily reports on her, simple updates on her schedule and well-being, but he refused to look at the photographs they included. To see her face would be to surrender. He immersed himself in the brutal mechanics of his empire, holding meetings in rooms where the air was thick with fear and unspoken threats, making decisions that shifted the city's balance of power. He surrounded himself with the darkness he believed he deserved, using the cold, hard logic of his business to starve the part of him that yearned for her light. It was a self-imposed exile, a king locking himself in the highest tower of a castle he had built from a lifetime of sins, all to keep the one person he cared for safe from the monster on the throne. One night, as another storm lashed against the city, Clara stood at her window, watching the lightning illuminate the skyline. The view was a distorted echo of the one she had seen from his car, a lifetime ago. The memory of that night was no longer just a source of terror. It was now layered with a deep, melancholic understanding. She finally saw his departure not as an act of abandonment, but as a sacrifice. He had shown her his true nature and then had torn himself away, not to save himself, but to save her from it. It was the only act of genuine, selfless protection he could offer. He was a poison, and he had chosen to quarantine himself. The realization did not lessen the pain, but it gave it a new, heartbreaking meaning. The silence between them became a living entity, a vast, charged space filled with everything that had been left unsaid. It was in the pause before she entered her apartment, in the way he would stop and look at an orchid in a florist's window, in the shared language of the rain falling on their separate, lonely worlds. Their connection had not been severed, it had been submerged, driven into the deep, quiet currents that ran beneath the surface of their lives. It was the echo of a touch in a storm, the memory of a shared breath in the aftermath of violence. It was a bond forged in transgression and sealed in a quiet that was louder and more permanent than any spoken word, a promise of a story that was not yet over. A year passed, a quiet, deliberate turning of seasons. The hospital, once a place of mere survival for Clara, was now a place of growth. A new wing, funded by a massive anonymous donation, was being dedicated. The autumn air was crisp, filled not with the tension of a society gala, but with the genuine, hopeful murmur of a community celebrating new life. Clara stood not in a borrowed dress, but in her own simple professional attire, a respected senior nurse, a quiet pillar of the institution. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was at the very heart of this world of healing, her world, made stronger and more secure by a power she had once feared, a ghost she had learned to live with. The ceremony was brief. A local official spoke, then the hospital administrator, and finally a polished bronze plaque was unveiled beside the entrance. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Etched in elegant script were the words, "The Paulo Thorne Pediatric Wing." The name was not his, but it was his. She knew it with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. This was not a monument to his power, but to his pain. This was the name of the wound she had seen in his eyes, the source of the ancient sorrow he carried. He had taken the darkest part of himself, the genesis of his violent life, and transformed it into a place of hope and healing for children. It was not a gift to her. It was an offering to a past he could never change, guided by the light he had found in her. In that moment of profound, heart-stopping realization, she felt it, the familiar, unnerving sensation of being seen. It was a pressure in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was meant only for her. Her gaze lifted from the plaque, scanning past the smiling faces, past the manicured lawns of the hospital courtyard. She looked up, her eyes drawn to the sleek, modern lines of the new building. There, on a glass-enclosed balcony 3 floors above, a solitary figure stood in the deep afternoon shadows. He was a silhouette of tailored darkness against the bright sky, a king observing his creation, not with pride, but with a quiet, somber reverence. He was a world away, yet his presence was as immediate and as powerful as if he were standing right beside her. He was not looking at the ceremony. He was looking only at her. The vast physical distance between them was a chasm, a perfect metaphor for the 2 worlds they could never bridge. Yet, in that single shared gaze, the chasm vanished. Time seemed to slow, the sounds of the crowd fading into a distant hum. His eyes, even from afar, held the entire story. The debt of blood, the violence in the rain, the agonizing choice to walk away, and now this final, silent act of penance. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was showing her what she had made him capable of. He was proving that even a man like him could be taught to build something other than a tomb, that his dark power could be wielded to create a sanctuary. In his stillness, she saw his surrender. In her quiet, accepting gaze, she offered him a peace he had never known. It was a silent, mutual absolution, a final acknowledgement of the bond that had irrevocably altered them both. A small, sad smile touched Clara's lips, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking understanding. As if he had felt it across the distance, Julian gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a farewell, a release, and then he simply stepped back, dissolving into the shadows of the building he had created, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of healing and the echo of a presence that would forever be a part of her. He was gone, but he was everywhere. Clara turned back to the gleaming plaque, her hand rising, not to her cheek, but to her own heart. She was no longer just a healer of bodies. She was the solitary keeper of a ghost's redemption. He had not pulled her into his darkness. He had instead allowed her light to illuminate a small corner of it, and in that space, a garden for sick children would now grow. Some debts are not meant to be repaid, only transformed. If this silent story of sacrifice and redemption reached a place in your heart, let your voice be heard. Like this story, share it with someone who understands that even the deepest wounds can inspire healing, and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe so you never miss a journey where hope finds its way into the most unexpected shadows.